Okay, first question this week comes in from an anonymous Instagram follower. And they're talking about the everyday athlete's volume. So question/observation for the Matchbox podcast. Sorry to bring up the repetitive volume topic, but I've become frustrated with the narrative that training under 8 hours per week is a time-crunched athlete or low-volume athlete or someone who doesn't prioritize training. While not everyone is on Strava, it's a pretty solid sample size of the athletic population, and my year in sport has me training more than 96% of the rest of the people with a total time of 305 hours in the year, or less than 6 hours per week. I understand you coach to high-end athletes, but I feel your podcast content is missing the mark with the general athlete population who just hears you say, find more time to train. Could you try to give some practical, constructive advice to the everyday athlete who listens to you and is trying to improve their age group finish ranking rather than dismiss us because we're not elite? So I think they're alluding to, like, if assuming increasing volume is not an option, what's some advice that we could give for those athletes? So I would say let's just touch on the first part, talking about quote unquote time crunched and what criteria we would consider to be time crunched versus not time crunched.
Yeah. For example, the training plans that I sell them in 3 different volume categories. There's 6 hours a week, there's 10 hours per week, and there's 15 hours per week. Obviously you can go up from 15 hours per week. But I would say that at that point, you're definitely looking at wanting a coach. Like you shouldn't be looking for a cookie cutter training plan if you're training more than 15 hours per week. I would say that like 6 hours per week is the bottom. Like 6 hours per week is probably time crunched, and 6 hours, if you have less than 6 hours per week to train. And I've even heard people and this is, you could say that this is like being elitist here, but I've even heard people like Steven Seiler say this. If you're training less than 6 hours per week, then obsessing about the minutia of details about training is not something that you should be doing. Like you're not at that level where you need to be obsessing about minute details of training. You just need to ride your bike more, which I guess might sound elitist, but I don't think I'm alone in that opinion. I would say 6 hours is like the bottom.
So you think anything less than 6 hours is time crunched, or you're saying 6 hours should be the minimum? Yeah,
I'd say 6 hours.
Target.
6 hours is time crunched. Anything less than 6 hours, like, oh boy, how do I put this without sounding elitist? Like, I don't know why you're listening to this podcast. Like, go train more.
Whoa.
They're listening to this podcast while they're training, hopefully.
Sure, yeah, hopefully. But like, I guess the point that I'm getting at is if it's less than 6 hours, which hopefully is not an elitist number for you. It may be, it may not be. This guy said 8. I would put 8 in the time crunch category. Hopefully 6 hours is not an elitist number for you, but I would say that if it's less than 6, you don't need to be obsessing about minute details of training.
So I do think it's not as black and white as that. I do think training age plays a big factor in that. For example, if someone has a long history of training and now all of a sudden they find themselves in a time crunched situation where they only have 6 hours or less to train, I do think there are certain things that they can and should do to cater their training specific to what the demands they're looking for, because they have a wealth of aerobic base to kind of play from, assuming they have a long-standing training age. Now, if you're just starting, if you're only 2-3 years into your training, you don't have that big aerobic foundation already established, then I would agree. Then I would say really the main thing is like you're trying to build that platform to train from. And it takes a long time, whether that's 10 years or it's crammed into 3 years because you're training at 25 hours a week. It depends on the situation. but it takes a lot of volume over time to build that foundation. And I think once you have that foundation built, even on 6 hours a week, I think there are things you can do to be more specialized in what you're trying to have your, perform at your best for.
I would say that around 6 hours a week. So that's like roughly an hour a day with one rest day.
Yeah.
Right. That is the point at which you need to start thinking about making your training polarized or pyramidal in some way. You need to start thinking about having easier days and harder days.
Yep.
And I can go quote Steven Seiler on my YouTube channel saying this. I asked him, I was like, so like at what volume is your volume so low that you don't need to worry about polarization or either pyramidal or polarizing your training, essentially meaning you've got easy days and hard days. And he was like, if it's less than 5 or 6, then basically you can just smash it on every ride. You're going to be fine. And that's probably what you should do because you've got so little time to train. So that's where I'm coming from when I say this. Like if you're below that threshold, it really is just kind of like, okay, well, you ride so infrequently or so little that if you're on the bike, you should be going hard.
No shot. You can't tell me that if somebody's training 5 days a week, an hour, like every day through the weekday, just say an hour a day, and they go out as hard as they can for that hour, that they're just going to consistently improve. No, you have to.
No, they're going to hit a plateau because they're going to hit a plateau.
You're saying that they're fine if they just smash it on every ride at 5 hours or 6 hours or less.
Well, I think Dylan, you're
well,
just
I'm saying
that...
6. Okay, I'll include 5 in that because 5 could be 5 days a week of training. I'll say the threshold is 5, but like if you're training less than 5, I would say it's like get on the bike and get yourself a good hearty workout in. Like talking about having easy days and hard days doesn't apply until we get to 5+. I'll include 5 in that.
Also, real quick, sorry, Adam, there's some feedback. I think it's coming from your mic on your headphones because when it brushes up against your shirt, sounds staticky.
Is that better?
I don't know. Go like this with your... Oh, yeah, no, I still hear it. It's still super loud.
But is it coming from this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. My mic must be using my headphones.
Yeah, I think you're using your headphone mic.
Okay, well...
Whatever, just run with it.
I just won't do it. Yeah, I'll just make sure
good.
I don't. Okay.
I do feel like we need to apologize, though, because I do think I can see where this person is coming from. But not that I want to side with us. Wait. Not that I want to, like, defend our position, but in a lot of cases, people give these questions and they don't give specific details. If somebody said, hey, this is my question, but I only have 6 hours a week to train, we would specify, like we would give them practical advice. But in any scenario, we're just giving the optimal way to train for that thing. And usually that does entail the most volume you can do to be the most prepared for that. So
I do want to say that sometimes too, when I'm answering these questions, I'm not trying to be an elitist. I'm trying to be a realist, if that makes sense. So if you, for example, a lot of the times these questions are, how many times have we gotten a question saying, I ride 10 hours a week, I've hit a plateau, I don't know what to do. I can't get past 300 watts FTP on 10 hours a week. That's, I've been training for whatever, X number of years, hit a plateau, this plateau, like I can't get past it. And this is not an elitist answer. This is a realist answer. It's like, there's a way to get past the plateau and you're not going to like the answer. The answer is go to 12 hours per week, go to 14, go to 16. If that's not possible, like you might be stuck at that plateau. And that's a realist answer. That's not necessarily an elitist answer in my view.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, to go back to the question, so they, they were saying they didn't like that the stigma of time crunched athlete or low volume athlete, or that both of those can allude to someone who doesn't prioritize training. And they didn't like that. They said 96% of people fall into that. Well, I mean, the time crunched athlete nomenclature really just came from coaches that were like, hey, we're coaching mostly everyday athletes, people that are working full-time jobs, have families, they have life outside of bike racing that they need to prioritize. So what can we do with the rest of the time that they have available to train? And they just coined it time crunched athlete because that's really what it is. If you weren't time crunched, you wouldn't be offended by someone saying you should increase your volume, right? Because if you could increase your volume, you probably would. So that's really what it is. It's just time crunched, meaning I only have so much time to train during the week, and I'm going to spend as much time as I can of that allotted time frame dedicated to my craft. But that still means you're time crunch. You don't have the luxury of being able to just add 5 hours a week like we're talking about. So
yeah, and this is no, like, this is no knock on time crunched athletes. Like, I don't
right.
I mean, maybe we come off this way, and if we do come off this way, I do apologize, but like, I'm not like knocking somebody who's time crunch. Everybody's got different priorities in life, and everybody's got different responsibilities, and not everybody is at the whatever elite level. So, you got to prioritize things in your life. It's not if you can only do 10 hours a week, you can only do 10 hours a week. I think that sometimes, though, you do need to be realistic with what is achievable with 10 hours per week. I do actually think that sometimes people are asking more from themselves than 10 hours a week, or whatever amount of hours per week they can do is able to give them, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in one of the hard things in the current landscape of racing is gravel racing has sort of taken at least the domestic scene by storm, and everyone's very interested in gravel. In what is gravel racing? It's just ultra endurance racing. It's very long races, and just like marathon training, or even we're talking beyond marathon training. Once you're talking 5 to 15-hour races. Marathon training takes a lot of time and dedication to do well, and not even to just do well, but to finish. So like these races that cater more towards the endurance athlete requires more endurance training. That's just sort of the bottom line there. There's not a whole lot. I think this is what you're getting at, Dylan. There's not a whole lot you can do to restructure your training to really move the needle a whole lot in one direction or another if you're only training, let's say, 3 hours a week. If you're only doing 3 sessions a week, what is within those 3 hours isn't probably going to move the needle a whole lot. Now, if you're just doing zone 1 versus going and doing actual intervals, okay, there's a difference there. But we're talking about like how are you periodizing the training stimulus? I still think that periodization is important for any level of athlete. I think you just need to constantly be changing the stimulus that you're introducing to your body. But how you go about doing that, what are the fine details? Are you doing 8-minute threshold versus 12-minute threshold? Probably not going to matter as much. What matters the most is the consistency. So if you've got 6 hours a week to train, so our athlete in who submitted the question here, they did 305 hours last year, which would be just a little bit less than 6 hours per week. 52 hours per week times 6, that'd be 312. So yeah, I mean, if that's what you have, the most important thing is like hit 6 hours every week. Don't have a 8-hour week and then a 2-hour week and then a 4-hour week and then a 0-hour week. If you can hit 6 hours every single week and you're doing something to periodize it, meaning every 4 to 8 weeks, you're just changing the stimulus slightly. It doesn't even have to be like drastically. It could be just increasing the duration by a handful of minutes of each interval, or increasing the intensity of the interval by X amount and decreasing the duration. You're like, as long as you're changing that stimulus about every 8 weeks at most, you're at least going to be better off than if you just do the same workout every day. That's actually an experiment that we've talked about how I'm kind of like doing all these different experimental training methods. One thing that I've actually considered doing too is like only doing one interval session every day, every single interval session for a whole year to see what happens, like see how long it takes to reach that plateau basically. Because I guarantee it's actually quite sooner than you imagine. Like if you do the same exact workout for 3 months straight, you're gonna see a plateau pretty quick. And that's the pitfall that most people end up in, is they think they might be changing the stimulus, but if you're still hitting pretty close to that same energy system, eventually your body's going to meet those demands and it's just going to go into maintenance mode. And that's part of the challenge with training less than 6 hours a week, is your body pretty quickly goes into maintenance mode. And that's what we're trying to avoid. That's, when we're talking about increasing volume, it's really like you need to pull your body out of maintenance mode so that it like thinks it needs to make more adaptations. You're tricking your body into making more adaptations. That's plain and simple all it is. And you can do some of that with intensity, but only to a certain extent.
Yeah. Also, I think, I think essentially what this person is asking is like, okay, look, I have 6 hours. I don't know how much time does this person have? 6, 8? I don't know. Whatever. It's
6 hours.
Yeah, 6 hours. I have 6 hours. I don't have more. What can I do with that? I think that we've talked a lot on this podcast about block periodization. I think the two things we talk about the most are volume and block periodization. And look, if you have, I think that is legitimately something that you can try if you're hitting a plateau and you can't possibly increase your volume. You can try an block periodization block with intensity, where you're doing intensity every single day of the week for a week and then giving yourself adequate recovery afterwards. That's something that you legitimately can try to do if you can't possibly increase volume. And we've talked about that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, it's too early to let the cat out of the bag, but I've talked about how one of the things I'm trying this year is this like block training all season long. And I think that might actually be a key training principle, or training method for time crunch athletes that like I may consider adopting in the future and applying to athletes, is like, if you're because I'm basically time crunch right now. I don't have endless time to train anymore. My goal volume each week, like I put on my whiteboard, I would like to train for 8 hours a week, and I haven't hit that in like months. Like I can't even get myself to do 8 hours a week. But I think the block training is gonna tell me something this year, and I have a feeling it's gonna be a method that I would implement in the future. Maybe not as like crazy as doing it from January through October, November, however long I do it for, but for doing it maybe 6 months leading into an event, if someone's training less than 8 hours, it's something I might consider.
Yeah. So I don't know if we pissed that person off more or less or whatever.
So if anyone out there, if you want more specific advice, like catered a little bit more towards your situation, the more information you can share with us, the better. In this case here, all we know is this athlete's time crunched. We don't have a whole lot of history or the ins and outs of what they're currently doing. That's definitely helpful information. And like, I coach plenty of athletes who only have 6 hours a week to train. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. That's just the reality of the situation. And if you want to get the most out of yourself, I do agree. You have to, like, 6 hours is, you want to make the most of those 6 hours, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I do usually have the conversation with those athletes of like, where can we squeeze in an extra couple hours here and there? And usually we can find it.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're listening, I don't want you to feel dismissed because you can't do 10 plus hours. Adam just said he's trying to do 7 to 8 a week. I actually looked back on my
Average
Strava.
is like
I've been
4.
doing Yeah, I've been doing 6 between riding and running, maybe a little bit more with yoga and strength, but still not a lot. So I feel like you and I, Adam, try and bring that perspective of more of the everyday athlete. Why are you laughing?
No, it's good. It's good.
Yeah.
We need all the perspectives.
Yeah.
So I also said this on the last podcast. I know this about myself. I'm very much an optimizer. I don't like to compromise in things, and it's why I'm such a marginal gains nerd to the nth degree. Because I don't want a compromised equipment. I want the fastest equipment. And I don't want to compromise training. I want the best training. So for me, like just me personally, like I have never once in my life put anything I don't, this is probably, I don't know if I should be saying this on a podcast, but I've never once in my life put anything above my training. You know what I mean? Like if I have to do 30 hours in a week, that's what I'm gonna do. I'm not gonna be like, well, I can't do it because I got this thing and that thing and whatever. And I realize that not everybody's like that, and not everybody needs the most optimal thing possible. They just need like optimal for what works in their life.
Yeah. So in again, for this athlete, just know, like, I've pretty much always considered myself a time crunched athlete. Even when I was training upwards of 20 plus hours a week, I know that sounds crazy, but I'm comparing myself to Dylan and the likes of Dylan, guys that are actually doing it full time. If I could have, I would have trained 30 plus hours a week, but I didn't. I've never had that luxury. So I even considered myself at 20 hours a week to be time crunched, which is why I always had a coach. I always made sure my training plan was extremely sound, and I adhered to it to a T, because I even needed to maximize my training, on those 20-hour weeks. So I don't want anyone to feel like the time crunched athlete is somehow a degrading term. It's not. It's just a term that has been coined for someone who can't train full time. And if you're training anything less than full time, you fall into the time crunch category.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Let's move on to Matt's question here. This is a bit of a long one. So this is a good example for if you want specific advice, you got to send specific information. Matt says, and he's talking about, is it okay to increase endurance intensity? Hey, Matchbox Squad. Thanks so much for the podcast and sharing your knowledge. I have a question about Zone 2 base miles early in the bike year when I'm also ramping up volume from a decline. Due to having a kid, my 2024 volume was pretty low, about 6 hours per week, including all activity types, cycling, running, lifting. I am ramping back up and currently around 10 hours per week with a goal of 12 to 13 average for 2025 and a peak volume of 14 to 15 hours per week. The question, is it okay, beneficial, or detrimental for my base training right now to be about 25% mid zone 2, 50% high zone 2, and 25% low zone 3 based on heart rate? RPE feels a little better than heart rate from an aerobic standpoint, which I associate with lifting. See below. That distribution of power is for each ride lately, more or less. Everything I hear in your podcast and others says that I should reduce the intensity of my training. However, it made sense to me to push a little harder right now to normalize my old zone 2 power, call it 210 watts, since I don't have any tough intervals that are compromising my workload. My hope is that pushing high zone 2 and a little low zone 3 will improve my base fitness faster so I can do that 200 to 210 watt for long durations, 4+ hours in a couple months without overworking myself then. To remain comfortably in mid zone 2 right now, I'd be closer to 190 watts. I am able to complete all of my workouts just fine, including the lifting. I figured that I am building capacity for work right now, and as my hours increase on the bike, I can reduce intensity into the mid to low zone 2 range, ideally without much reduction in power, dropping to 1 time per week in the gym and ceasing any heavy lifting, since that absolutely trashes my ability to do high intensity workouts. Heavy lifting doesn't help bike workouts in the near term, heart rate for me is roughly 10 beats per minute higher for any power over 55% of FTP. Let me just see. Mentioning. Okay. So they're basically saying yeah, let me skip that part because it's talking about heart rate and lifting and it affecting their zone 2 training. But here's some other random details. Historical average for 2022 and 2023 was 10 hours per week. My short duration power, 5 minutes or less, is actually better than it used to be. Lifting started about 8 months ago, but long duration power is definitely lower. Normal weekly schedule. So they talk about their schedule. We can maybe get to that if we want to get more specific, but they basically can train Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday on the bike, Tuesday, Thursday in the gym, and then Saturday, Sunday on the bike.
Okay.
Current FTP is 300 watts. And let's see, I just want to look what their race goals are. Racing starts late April, ends with Big Sugar in October, 65% gravel. We know what Big Sugar is. Yeah. The rest of this is just more context, but
all right, repeat those percentages of zones again.
Yeah, so let's go back to that. So that's kind of the underlying question is Matt really wants to know, can he accelerate getting back to his, previous baseline more or less by increasing his intensity for his zone 2 rides, or his endurance rides, we'll call it. He calls them base rides, but I don't always like the term base because that implies a certain time of year. I just consider everything to be endurance rides. Base is more of like a period of the season that you're in, is what I usually refer to it as. But 50, so 25, so this is any given endurance ride, we'll call it. Any given endurance ride, he's doing 25% in mid zone 2, 50% in high zone 2, and 25% in low zone 3. So that would, on average, put him at the high end of zone 2.
Yeah, stop doing that. Yeah, no, just if it's, and I think another big issue here is that this is not like I do this once a week or I do this twice a week, where I mix in some zone 3 with my zone 2. That would be more acceptable. This is like every single time you ride, you're kind of just doing a mixture of zone 2 and zone 3, and hitting zone 3 a little bit is not a huge deal, but if it's 25% of your ride, that's a pretty significant amount. No, I would keep it. I mean, being in high zone 2 is fine. Being in low zone 2 is fine. Being mid zone 2 is fine. I would say keep it in that zone 2 range. If it's a endurance ride, keep it in that zone 2 range. Do not go to zone 3. And the reason why I'm saying that is, I mean, I've talked about this research quite a bit on my channel. Seiler has a study where he shows that if you go above that first lactate turn point, so into zone 3, you are starting to stress your autonomic nervous system. I would say that this is like the classic mistake that going back to time crunched athletes, this is the classic mistake that time crunched athletes make. They say, well, I'm going to accelerate my training by going harder and going into zone 3. And look, if it's January and you've been training for, you haven't built up a lot of cumulative fatigue yet, that might feel absolutely fine. But come Big Sugar, which is a long time from now, it may not feel so fine. Like, cumulative fatigue is definitely something to consider. And cumulative fatigue from doing this kind of training is definitely a concern. So I wouldn't do that personally. I would definitely stick to zone 2 if it's a zone 2 ride.
So here's well, go ahead, Caitlin. You can go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it's interesting, he specifies that those percentages are based off of heart rate too, not power. So I think, I don't know if it's in this order, but he says 25% mid zone 2, 50% high zone 2, and then 25% low zone 3. So in my mind, if he's doing a 4-hour ride, that means that last 25%, his heart rate has just kind of drifted.
It could be.
Yeah.
It doesn't quite delineate, how that distribution works out. If it is just cardiac drift, then that's even
Yeah.
probably more concerning.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the case, though. I think my guess is that he's just kind of targeting high zone 2, and he's getting sometime a little bit above that, sometime a little bit below that, but he's trying to like really hit that fine line between zone 2 and zone 3, and that's where he's targeting. And he just, naturally is having a little bit of time below and above that cumulative.
Okay.
So here's a question, Dylan, for you. Because you mentioned the research from Seiler and some other people that they've been, that have been done. When we're talking about triggering autonomic nervous system stress, is it truly just once you get above that lactate turn point 1, the autonomic nervous system is kind of turned on, and any time spent above that is stressing the nervous system? Or does it matter what you're doing above that? So here, like my to further my question, if you're doing tempo, let's say it's zone 3, so you're turning on that autonomic nervous system, is that having less of a detriment on, is it having less cumulative effect on nervous system stress than, say, doing zone 5 work? Or is your nervous system either on or off? And if it's on, then you're accumulating stress, and if it's off, then you're not.
So I do wish that I had the study right in front of me. But the conclusion of the study was, and look, I don't know that we can get extremely granular. Like if you go over your zone 2 for 30 seconds on a climb, is that going to completely screw your whole ride? My guess is no.
No, I want to think
you can get extremely granular with this.
Yeah.
The conclusion of the specific study that I'm referencing is that it is kind of like an on-off switch. In fact, I think they use the word on-off switch in the study, and they say that any intensity above this first lactate turn point, whether it's like 30/30s or just a bunch of tempo, is going to stress your autonomic nervous system the same way. It won't stress your entire body the same way, obviously.
Sure.
But as far as your autonomic nervous system is concerned, it has been turned on. It has been stressed. And I wish I had the study in front of me, but I believe that they use the term on-off switch in the study.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's why I used that term, because when we met with Seiler and from reading some of the research, that's kind of like what I had gathered, and sort of the principle that I've sort of adopted over the years is basically anything above that, you're stressing the nervous system. So that's why Seiler a lot of times talks about, like, if you're gonna do that, get the most bang for your buck. And he, like, his favorite combination of workouts are either 8-minute threshold, 4-minute VO2 max, or Tabatas. Like those are kind of like the 4 called like building, or 3 building blocks of interval sessions that he typically like gravitates towards. And the reason is, like, he's like, if you're gonna do it, like, do it, go do the efforts. Whereas, like, and I think the reason I bring it up is if you think about it that way, where it is kind of this on-off switch, it's easier to understand the detrimental effects that could be happening here, because, like you said, you can do 30 minutes of tempo even if you're not super fit. Like a lot of athletes this time of year are doing tempo work. You can manage it. It might still be kind of hard, but you can manage it. And the next day you're not going to, likely be feeling super sore or tired or anything. So you can kind of get away with it and feel like, it's not that big of a deal. Like it didn't add that much stress to my body or whatever. But you are like that. If you think about that on-off switch like that, to me, like that was like a red or green light moment, like, or whatever, light bulb moment in my mind, where it's like, oh, that makes way more sense. Like, I'm either turning it on and then it's on, or I'm trying to prevent the light switch from turning on. So I would go back to kind of like what you said to Matt earlier, is like, I don't think that's going to accelerate anything. If anything, maybe getting more structured with some of the intensity that you're including in this time of year is going to be better off. Doing more quality work at intensity is going to get you to back to that baseline quicker than what you're talking about here, which is like really riding that fine line every single day, pushing the limits of what you're doing aerobically.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I know we kind of talked about in the last question, but like, kudos to Matt here. Matt's, he's making some extra room for his training this year. I mean, he's going to push his weekly average up by 25%, which that's not nothing. I think just doing that alone, Matt, you're going to see yourself get back to that baseline pretty quick. And, you should see yourself moving past that baseline pretty handily.
So there was one part of his question where he was saying, I don't feel fatigued from doing this. Like I can handle this type of training right now, and it's fine. Like I'm not overly fatigued from doing this, so I might as well, right? Which I think is a little bit of a slippery slope. First of all, first thing that I will say about that is that you don't have to be taking yourself to the edge of fatigue all year long. Like it's okay to have parts of the, and in fact, it's preferable to have parts of the year where your training is not taking yourself to the edge of fatigue, where if you add one more interval or one more hour to your training, you're going over the edge of overtraining. You don't want to be doing that all year long. So just because you can perfectly handle it and it's fine, doesn't necessarily mean that you should do it. And also what I will say is that if you can handle it, what would be better to do, if you have the time in your schedule to do it, is to increase your volume so that it's an amount of volume that, like, for example, I'm just throwing out hypothetical right now. If you're doing this kind of training at 6 hours per week and you're like, I can handle that, no problem. Well, then, as opposed to doing that kind of training for 6 hours a week, what I would do is do 8 hours of training properly in zone 2. Like increase the volume and keep it in zone 2. That to me is preferable to what you are doing.
Sure. Yeah, I mean that's where, the last question we talked about, like increasing volume is almost always going to be a better solution to getting you to that next milestone or pushing you over that plateau than increasing volume. If it was as easy as increasing volume, then everyone would do a hard session every single week or every single day of every single week. But we all know, we've all been there. Like you reach that breaking point pretty quick with intensity. So that's why intensity and in structuring your intensity is not always the solution. I know everyone wants that to be the case, and there's lots of plans that are based around sweet spot training and sub-threshold training so that you can pack in more intensity volume during a week. But a lot of those are also based on the time crunched principles. And, again, if you do that, if you're only training 3 to 5 hours a week, maybe you can get away with that. But once you start pushing that to 6, 8, 10, 12 hours a week, it just becomes way too much intensity distribution.
Yeah. I mean, I think that this sort of applies to both of the questions that we've got, but I think a lot of times, maybe sometimes people think that there's a magic interval workout out there, or there's a magic intensity zone that's going to get them where they need to be. And if they only knew which magical combination of intervals to do in a session, they could add 20 watts to their FTP in a week or something. And I think sometimes, people who are I guess time crunched is the best way to put it. Like, I hesitate to use the word time crunch because of the person who had the first question. I don't know if he thought that was an offensive term. I don't think it's an offensive term. It's just an accurate term. Like you're crunched on time. They're kind of like, okay, well, what can I do with this time? Like I there must be some magical combination of intervals that I can do that'll unlock this hidden potential. And I don't know. I guess sometimes the realist in me just needs to let people know that like it's rarely the case.
Yeah, I mean, you have pre-built training plans that people can buy. You said you talked about you have 6 hours, 10 hours, and 15 hours, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would guess I haven't actually reviewed your training plans, but I would guess if you looked at the weekly intensity distribution and even like the types of sessions that are going into each of those 3 different training volumes, they're pretty similar. The main difference is just how much endurance training you're tacking on top of that. Now your individual session for intensity, maybe someone gets, because you're accumulating more fitness, maybe you can push the limits of what that threshold duration is, or how many VO2 max intervals you can do, just because you have more aerobic conditioning to support that. But as far as like the construct, it's not like there's some magic pill that is in the 6-hour week training plan that, the 15-hour week isn't dipping into or whatever.
Yeah.
And I personally think, I think we've talked about this before too. A lot of the online training platforms where, you hop on your trainer and you're using this platform to program, or control whatever your workout is. A lot of times the reason the workouts look so crazy and sporadic is just because they're trying to keep you engaged. It's not because there's some magic, magic algorithm or anything like that. There's not a magic formula that they're using to like create these unicorn workouts. They're just they want to keep you engaged and keep you coming back, because at the end of the day, they're a training company, but they're also an entertainment company. So
yeah,
I personally prefer, I'll sometimes do that with athletes because I get it. You just, as an athlete that's going out there training day in, day out, sometimes it does feel a little stale, but I would prefer to just keep all of the workouts super simple. And it's like really easy to remember. You don't have to pull out your training peaks and know and go like, oh, what was I supposed to do for this interval again? Because it's different than the last interval or whatever. It's like, I'd prefer to just keep it super simple and just keep it consistent and periodize it appropriately.
Yeah, people don't like to hear it, but training is really simple. You can't lose sight of the big picture. If all of your training, all of your energy systems support each other. So if you're raising your threshold, you're raising your zones in zone 2. And he's asking if I ride zone 3 is my he's basically saying if I make my zone 2 ride not a zone 2 ride, am I going to get to this point faster? And I don't dissect if you're not doing zone 2, then you're not doing zone 2. Like everything needs to be, just keep it simple.
I also, this is like a personal preference, but I would say for like, I never prescribe a workout that's so complicated that you need to like write it on your top tube.
Exactly.
Like I see people, and now with, modern day computers, like you can have the workout perfectly planned on your head unit and you don't need to do this. But I mean, the amount of times I've seen like a picture of somebody who's got the intervals that they need to do for the day on like a piece of paper on their stem or their top tube. Again, this is kind of my personal coaching preference, I guess, but a workout should never be so complicated that you can't just remember it in your own head.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, do you want to do this last one, or should we call it there for now?
I think we should do the last one just because
okay.
We've touched on it in the first couple of questions anyway.
Okay, yeah, it'll be quick. It's from Chris. Chris says, "Howdy, Matchbox Squad. I'm in my late 30s with a wife and a kid and a full-time office job." See the theme here? I spent 2021 and 2022 doing structured training and had moderate crit racing success for an unathletic, slightly overweight, middle-aged man. However, in 2023
and 20... 30 middle-aged? Wait a second.
I feel it, man. I feel you, Chris.
Wait, what did he say his age was? 30?
Late 30s.
Late
30s.
30s.
Okay, all right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
I'm 30 now.
Yeah. Welcome to the club. However, in 2023 and 2024, I was unable to stick with a training plan for a full season and found myself skipping rides altogether because I couldn't get the motivation going. While I understand I have too much to juggle with to make my hobby also a form of dedicated work, I still want to be able to keep up on fast local group rides and practice crits and even target a few more gravel races and fondos throughout the year for good results. My strategy for 2025 is to spend the majority of the year only worrying about time on the bike, say 8 to 10 hours per week, but making that time whatever I want. Group rides, Swift racing, even tooling around on my BMX bike with my kid. But I also want to target a few events and use a 1-month structured plan to sharpen the knife. Is it even worth it to only have structure for 1 month preceding my big event? Or am I better off choosing between riding for the simple joy of it and being at the pointy end of these rides and races? Thanks, Chris. I thought this was a great question.
I love this question so much. Chris, if you don't have a coach, I would love to coach you. I think
Why, so you can only work once every 3 months?
What? No. I feel like he's hacked life. He's realized that instead of trying to balance everything in the sense that you're dedicating the same amount of time or rationing out your time based on your priorities and having that structure 7 days a week, 365 days a year, you've realized that balance is in fact realizing that in different seasons or different phases of your life, you're allowed to give more time in pursuit of a goal. So he wants to do this one race, and who am I as a coach to say, like, no, 1 month isn't enough, you should have come to me 6 months ago? That's not doing anybody any good. So yeah, 1 month is enough. I mean,
yeah, I will say a lot of times I have to have this conversation with my athletes of like, I'm here, like my sole job is to support whatever your goals are, whatever your lifestyle is, whatever you want to get, however you want to get the most out of yourself. It is my job to just support that. I'm not there to judge anyone or to be critical. I mean, there are certain times where I have to, like, maybe give a little, slap on the, back of the hand just to say, like, hey, like, the time is now. Like, we got to do this workout, but for the most part, like, I'm just there to support, and I'm on your team. Like, I'm not, a lot of times I think they have to, like, impress their coach or do something to, like they think of their coach a little bit too critically, when that's not always the case. So like Caitlin said, like, if that's what you want to do, I kind of agree. Like, it would be fun. Maybe Chris, I would loop you into some of my block training here, or something like that. I do think that what would probably, I would definitely space out starting your structure maybe more than a month from you only have to do the structure for maybe a month, but I would give yourself like a 2-week buffer probably after the structure, because otherwise you might be too fatigued coming into the event. If you go from not doing any structure to then doing 3 weeks of structure and then a race, you might not perform at your best on that race. I would almost start at like 6 weeks before the event, do your 4 weeks of structure, give yourself like a week buffer or something, and then go to the event. Just to like give yourself a chance to like kind of come down from that. Or the other option would be, I do think it would be beneficial to have one, it doesn't have to be like a true structured plan, but maybe one structured session per week. And that just kind of keeps like your mind in it a little bit, and it makes it so that when you do ramp into that 1 month block training, it's not as foreign, because there's a learning curve to doing structure too. Even if you're used to doing structure for many years, if you take a couple months off, everyone's done this over an off season, that first like week or two back of doing structured workouts is challenging. You're not hitting your numbers. You feel frustrated at times because the workout feels harder than you think it should. So I just think having that like one maintenance session in, even if it's every 2 weeks, just so that you're familiar with what that structure feels like, I think that's going to be beneficial come time for you to do that 1 month block training or whatever you're going to do, the 1 month structured training. So it's not as foreign and there's not as steep of a learning curve when you do integrate that structure back in.
I wish he said what his event was, because he said he's done crit racing, so I don't know if it's some local.
Yeah, he says fast rides, crit racing, and maybe gravel or Grand Fondo.
Okay,
yeah. So, I mean that could also, going back to setting proper expectations.
Yeah.
You might need to set different expectations for those crit races and the gravel race, because those are two completely different demands. Obviously the gravel race is much longer, and it's going to require a little bit more specific, harder training than, say, your crit race. Like, you could probably tune up for a crit race on just this kind of like fun joyriding, going out just generally riding for a few months. Like, if you just do 2 or 3 weeks of like Tabatas or something, like, you can tune up for a crit race pretty quickly. I don't think you're going to have quite as quick turnaround for tuning up for a gravel race.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe treat the gravel races or the Grand Fondo as a challenge, not so much like striving for a result.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with all that.
But yeah, any structure is going to be better than no structure. I would also put that out there. So, and training should be fun. I think we have all been in the situation with athletes too, where we can start to sense when an athlete stops having fun with it, and it does turn to work. It's like, I just got to do that workout again. You can start to feel and see that motivation start to wane, and that's not a good situation. I mean, even for you, Dylan, like, you just love riding your bike. Like, if you could spend all day on your bike, you probably would. But it's important for you, even, like, I'm sure you hit times where it's like, riding becomes more of a chore than I want it to be right now. And that can be hard to push through and keep the ride quality as high.
Yeah, I'm not always super motivated. Usually my motivation level is very closely linked to my fatigue levels. I will say that. And that's not the case for everyone. There are some people that their motivation levels, it's not because of how fatigued they are. They actually are just struggling with motivation. So it's kind of a different question, but yeah.
Just as a little tangent, what are like 1 or 2 things that you guys do to pull motivation when it's not there?
Or personally, or with an athlete?
Could be both.
Okay.
Maybe one of each.
Yeah, I think the answer is different. Like, if I have an athlete that's struggling with motivation and it's not a fatigue issue, then you can I'll try to get to what the root of the fatigue, or what the root of the lack of motivation is. Like, maybe it's just they've got too much stress at work, or family stuff, or maybe the workouts just aren't fun for them anymore. Like, they're not into structure, and that's not, if they're really not digging structured intervals, and that is causing them to ride their bike less, then those probably shouldn't be on their calendar, and the calendar needs to be shifted in some way that supports them having high motivation. So, like, maybe if maybe they've got the examples are endless, right? But, like, an example could be, like, maybe the beginning of the week is really stressful for them at work, so holding off volume until the end of the week is better for them. Or, maybe they've just doing intervals has gotten, like, really tedious for them, and they just need a break from doing intervals. Also something that's fine. For myself, I would say that the answer is different, because, as I said, my motivation levels are very closely tied to my level of fatigue. If I'm experiencing low motivation, it's probably because I'm on the verge of overtraining.
Sure.
And that is a symptom of overtraining, is loss of motivation to train. So
also, you need to recognize that your motivation is also attached to pressure from sponsors. And yes, you love to ride, but it's also your source of income too. So there's that motivation attached to it. For somebody that doesn't have that and it's just a hobby and you're questioning why you don't have motivation to do your hobby, I think you need to do some internal reflection. People look at motivation as this thing, like you should instead look at it as a state of like health is a state, but it revolves around good sleep, good nutrition, and movement. And those three things require work to achieve that state of health. Same thing with happiness. To achieve happiness, it requires work. People think it's just this thing that comes to you. Like, when will I be happy? When will I be healthy? When will I be motivated? But it requires work. It requires conscious choice. And that's my tangent.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with that. And I think that your motivation is actually very closely related to your internal state. And kind of where I was going with this was that for me personally, and I would say that this is the case for a lot of high-level elite athletes who don't normally struggle with motivation, if they out of nowhere find that they're struggling with motivation, it's usually because they are chronically fatigued, on the verge of overtraining, underfueling, a combination of all three. It usually actually has something to do with their internal state. It's not necessarily in their head.
Yeah.
And that's personally the case for me. If I'm struggling with motivation, 9 times out of 10, it's not just something that's in my head. It's something that's going on in my body. Like I haven't eaten enough. I've ridden too much. I'm overtrained, whatever.
Yeah, it could very much be that, but I think for a lot of people, it's not the physiological, it's the psychological.
Yeah, no, that's why I started this whole thing with talking about an athlete that this doesn't apply to. I was saying that this only applies to a certain sect of athlete. I'm not saying this applies to everyone.
Yeah.
At all. Definitely not saying that.
Yeah. But I would say this psychological can become the physiological in the sense, like, take the example of you might be setting expectations that are too out of your reach, and then it turns into, well, I don't think I have time to achieve that. I don't think I'm going to be ready to achieve that. And then it's kind of like, well, why even try? And then you lose motivation that way. I've been there too.
Yeah, and it's hard because when you rely on motivation to train, as soon as that motivation goes away, your training goes away. And that's where I think, like, a lot of what I try to do with my athletes is just encourage them through times where they just like feel a little bit unmotivated, and just like focus less on the specific performance and more on just like showing up. Like, if you just show up, do your best, encourage you to, like, if you have to drop the intensity a little bit, it's okay. But it's really like the process that's the most important, is like showing up day in, day out, and the consistency of it. And, sometimes we think like, I'm not going to have a good workout today because I'm not motivated. But you'd be surprised, like, if you just show up and try and get through the first couple intervals, like, sometimes that motivation all of a sudden like comes back to you, and that's like, I would say, so a few things, like, if I see the red flag, like Dylan's talking about, where it is training related or, stress related or fatigue related, I'll certainly change their calendar to make sure that we're not overtraining or overextending. But if it is just the latter, where it's like, sometimes you just have to kind of push through that or show up and just try. I usually encourage my athletes to just do one interval. If you can't get through even the first interval, then okay, maybe today's not the day. But if you can get through that first interval, hit your zone, whether it's the low end, high end, doesn't matter. Let's see if it comes around. And if it does, then you just keep proceeding. One more interval, and see if you can get through the workout. Because I think the more you can kind of chunk it up into those like little bite-sized bits where you can just, all I got to do is one interval right now. Sometimes it's easier to accommodate, or, to get through it. It can be tricky though.
I gotta run, guys. But...
All right. Yeah, we're getting to an hour, so that was good.
Mm-hmm.
All right, guys. We'll see you next week.
All right. See ya.